There is so much going on in this passage that it's hard to know even where to start. We have been hearing again and again over the last weeks as we've read along in Mark's Gospel, Jesus trying to teach the disciples what it means to be his followers and what they should do if they truly want to be great. That is to be servants, to welcome those who are as vulnerable and weak and unimportant as a child, to take up the way of the cross. And now for the third time, Jesus has been told the disciples what lies ahead of them. This time, Jesus includes even more graphic details about how the authorities are going to use their power against him. And so it's with great irony that James and John immediately ask if they could be given the places of privilege and of power on either side of Jesus in his place of glory. Ironic because in a few short weeks, Jesus will be lifted up to his glory on a cross, and the ones on the left and the right of him will also be hanging on crosses. It's not the kind of glory that James and John imagined. They've been deaf to what Jesus is saying. Maybe they're just practicing selective hearing. Maybe they're not fully deaf. Those of you who are parents know exactly what I'm talking about. Kids who seem to be deaf when you point out the things that need to be done, the tough work that has to get done, and then their hearing suddenly improves when you just whisper about the possibility of a fun outing. James and John were with Jesus just a few weeks before this. We read the story in Mark chapter 9 when Jesus was at the top of a mountain glowing with glory. And that experience seems to have blinded them to everything else that's going on, everything else that Jesus is teaching. It's with even further irony that James and John likely agree to drink that cup that Jesus would drink and be baptized with the baptism he is baptized with. Because this is the cup of suffering that even Jesus is going to ask his Father to take away from him, if that's possible. And this is the baptism that requires dying to oneself, literally. James and John just cannot imagine the kind of power that Jesus is talking about. They cannot imagine what Paul will later explain to the church in Corinth by saying, God's power is made perfect in weakness. I will delight in weakness, in insults, in hardship, in persecutions, in difficulties, Paul writes, for when I am weak, then I am strong. James and John had never seen Jesus' kind of power before. The power they knew came from when you or your family members were in charge, or at least sitting on the town council. The kind of power they knew came from wealth and prestige, the kind of power that comes when people arm themselves. Before we start to feel too superior to James and John or too arrogant in our judgment of that whole motley crew of disciples who seem upset with James and John primarily because they beat them to the ask, it would probably be wise for us to ask ourselves if we really do much better. Don't we also make overconfident promises to follow Jesus? Don't we promise at our baptisms that we are going to die to sin and live for Christ alone, and then repeatedly fail in our attempts to live sinless, selfless lives? Don't we also try to finagle things in order to get our way, or hope that we will get recognition and glory for all that we do, don't we also try to manage our reputations and preserve our place at the table? Jesus gathered the disciples around him and told them, "You know that the rulers of this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But not so with you. Among you, it will be different." The world has changed very little over 2,000 years from Jesus' description of the way people in places of authority or positions of power behave. Today, those who hold political or judicial power redraw the lines of voting districts to tip the scales in favor of their party retaining power. The Supreme Court has recently upheld a new law in North Dakota that will disenfranchise many Native Americans simply because their homes on the reservation do not have street addresses, and so it eliminates their right to vote. In our nation and around the world, powerful special interests will influence lawmakers to safeguard their profits, even at the cost of the environment or at the cost of the health of large populations. Haven't we seen this with the pharmaceutical companies that lobby to be protected from the liability of the opioid disaster and manipulate laws so that they can continue to profit off of victims of those opioid drugs? But Jesus says, "Not so with you. Among you, it will be different." From all around the world, there's a growing outcry against men who have used their positions of power to lord it over women in ways that range from simply paying a woman less than a man, all the way up to using rape as a weapon of war. I know that there are women in this room who have been hurt by a man who has been seeking to assert his dominance and power. Women who could say, "Me too." This month is Domestic Abuse Awareness Month, and studies show that when you gather a group of Americans together like this, 3/4 of us, that means all except maybe 10 of us here, personally know someone who has or was a victim of domestic abuse. But Jesus says to us, "Not so with you. Among you, it will be different." The world has changed little in 2,000 years, for we know that there are still women and men, girls and boys bought and sold by those who take advantage of their vulnerability, the vulnerability of poverty, in order to enslave them. Traffickers wield the threat of violence, showing their power by beating and drugging and threatening families in order to profit off of other human beings. There are those who will justify all sorts of manipulations of power, all sorts of unethical behavior, all sorts of lies, all sorts of immoral acts in order to preserve their own power and prestige. But Jesus says to us, "Not so with you. Among you, it will be different." It's not all perpetrators and politicians, even by everyday folks. There's a rise in the level of insults and words that demonize those who hold different positions or beliefs and who strive to hang on to a perceived advantage. Many everyday white folks perceive the Black Lives Matter movement as a threat rather than as a call for justice and equity. As a community and as a society, we have lacked the will to prioritize the problems of racial inequities, of child poverty, of unaffordable health care, because of what it may cost us if we recognize the rights of others. We're reluctant to speak up and actively condemn the abusive treatment of people, even children, who enter our country simply to escape homelessness and the hopelessness of poverty and violence, because of what it might cost us in privilege and in wealth by allowing them to share our bounty. To each of us, Jesus says, "Not so with you. Among you, it will be different." Jesus' power is different. Jesus' power came from giving up the privilege of his divine nature, accepting the weakness of a human body, submitting himself to the will of his Father. Jesus' power came from his willingness to set aside his own plans, his own needs, in order to restore health and hope to desperate people that he met along the way. Jesus' power comes paradoxically by allowing the earthly powers to come and throw against him all the insults, all the spit and hatred and physical violence, even the most difficult death of crucifixion, and absorb it all without protest. Jesus' death exposed the abusive powers of this world. Yet Jesus' life and death was so much more than simply this inspiring example. It was more than just a tragic protest against a ruthless and unjust system. Jesus' death actually did something. It secured a release from the hold of worldly power. Jesus told his disciples, "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Jesus' death won the liberation, the freedom of all who are oppressed, who are enslaved, who are impoverished, who feel hopeless and helpless under unjust systems of earthly power. Jesus' death set us free to live a different way, with a different kind of power. As we decide to follow Jesus, we're then to live in that way of Jesus, in the way of Christly power. And we do it for two reasons. First, because we want to emulate Jesus and to follow his teachings. He taught us to use our power to serve others. And so we host the homeless, and we put food in the backpacks of children who are hungry, and we put food into the wagons at our doors to feed those through the food pantries in town. We volunteer to deliver meals. We try to help others at our jobs and in our neighborhoods. We turn the other cheek. We give away our coats. We share the good news that there is a different way to live other than this constant tussle to retain power or to overpower. But there's another reason that we live as servants in the way of Christ. That's because we too have been set free. You and I have been liberated from the grip of guilt and set free from that selfish striving. We've been released from dead-end, defeated lives. Jesus ransomed you and me and gave us hope that life could be different. And so we respond with joy, and we respond with gratitude, and we long to help others find that same freedom and that same joy. And we seek to add. We seek to add to just providing food for the hungry so a child can eat for a weekend. We add to that the work of defeating child poverty altogether. And we add to our hosting of the homeless advocacy so that all people throughout the world will have a safe place to live. And we add to our growing awareness about the problems of human exploitation and enslavement, the provision of dignified work for others, and accountability for those who abuse their power. Of course, I can't take on all of that myself, and even us as one congregation can't do it all. And that's one of the reasons we support global servants, we support missionaries and others who work on behalf of the good news of Jesus' liberating power, of selfless, sacrificial, servant power that can break abusive power of this world. Jesus commissioned 12 disciples. And those disciples commissioned more disciples who commissioned more disciples. And together, over the continents and over the centuries, followers of Jesus have been praying and working for God's kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven. We're going to watch a short video that shows some of the work that our global servants, Annie and Jeff Dieselberg, do in Thailand to set women free from slavery.